Hello, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of our symposium. I'm so glad to see some familiar faces in our participant list. Today's panels will be focused around data and also alternative responses. So we're excited to get right into those. I'm going to pass the mic over to the CPRIS director, Kevin Strom, to welcome you further. Thanks.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of our RTI symposium. Welcome folks back who were joined us yesterday, and also attending new individuals that are joining from across the country or even internationally. So yesterday, I thought it was really a great day in terms of highly engaged, great panels, a lot of excellent questions that were really digging into these topics a little bit more, asking about some of the challenges, barriers, some of the relevance of some of the research that was discussed, and also ideas around sustainability, and which we all know is absolutely key for many of these topics. And I thought overall it really shared excellent examples of how research is informing practice, and that is across the panels, but also with the breakout discussions. So I hope we carry through with a lot of that today. You know, another key theme was raised by Maureen McGuff when she talked about, you know, there's a lot of promising areas, a lot of examples of innovation going on across the country, but too often these are in silos or sort of the best kept secrets. And so that's another goal here with our symposium, is to really highlight those as best we can, and to share really the good work that's been going across the country on these important issues. So a few things before we jump into our first panel. One is, you know, we want to hear today, but also even after today, about what are your needs, challenges, what are key questions that you're really grappling with, you know, and what can we do to help? And you know, this doesn't have to be just a once a year type conversation. We really want to hear, and we want to sort of, you know, continue to build out this community of practice. We also want to hear about symposium topics that you're interested in covering in future events, and you know, also how can we continue to make an event like this as interactive as possible, especially as we look to return to an in-person event next year, but also something that's going to be done in a way that really brings in our virtual participants as well and has them highly engaged. A few reminders: we will archive everything from the 2 events. We'll also likely splice up some of the panels so that people can go back and view just specific panels as well as the entire symposium. And then also we encourage you to contact us to be added to our distribution list, so you can keep in touch with symposium topics, but also other things that we push out, including our newsletter. But we promise not to clog your inbox with a lot of information or too much material. So looking forward to today. I think we got a great set of topics. The first panel will be focused on the role of data in really measuring and facilitating law enforcement and community connections, including how some more recent technology and what its role is in making a stronger connection. Really a theme that I think a lot of you have been hearing about in your communities, and maybe also working on, which is this idea of alternative responses to certain categories of 911 calls. And we'll be talking about some of the exciting work we've been doing in North Carolina and South Carolina, working with 7 cities across what's called the Cohort of Cities, which is an Arnold Ventures related effort. So, and then in our breakouts, covering a lot of really important topics, carrying over some of the themes from yesterday. One panel will be looking at law enforcement and public health collaboration. Also focus on property crime victims and how technology, including technology, can be used to better connect property crime victims with their needs for law enforcement. And then also a breakout looking at how advances in forensic technology and forensic analysis, including forensic genealogy, can be used to make really significant steps in addressing unsolved violent crimes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Peyton, and we'll get started with our first panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And I see Jake came off camera as well, so I will give it right back to him to introduce the panel and get us started.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Peyton. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day two of our policing symposium. We're really happy to have you here joining us for our panel on the role of data in measuring law enforcement and community relations. My name is Jake Kramer. I'm a senior policing researcher with RTI International, and I'll be moderating our panel today. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. We're going to share some positive, informative work with you all. So first up, we'll have Mike Planty. Mike is a senior director for the Center for Community Safety and Crime Prevention and RTI's Division for Applied Justice Research. Mike has extensive research experience in areas of victimization, school violence and safety, law enforcement, criminal justice systems, and national indicators of crime and violence. Following Mike, we have Dwayne Campbell. Dwayne is an executive fellow of Fuse Corps assigned to the Community Safety Department in Durham, North Carolina. And Dwayne's also the president of the North Carolina Evaluators Network. He's a data-driven expert who employs empowerment and utilization-focused evaluation methods to construct initiatives and policies that advance the interests of communities and engage with them. Following Dwayne, we'll have Lauren Atherley. Lauren's the Director of Performance Analytics and Research and a Senior Research Scientist with the Seattle, Washington Police Department. Lauren leads a regional research consortium, a national data working group on analytics and evidence-based policing, which is also affiliated with the Major City Chiefs Association, and an international research network. And last but not least, we have Mimi Stiles. Mimi founded Measure out in Austin, Texas, to promote community-led research and tools to tell real-life stories behind the numbers. As a catalyst for systems changes, Measure has grown into a fully operational nonprofit social enterprise that provides free data support to Black, Indigenous, and Brown-led organizations. So this panel is going to focus on data and how we can measure data on law enforcement and community relations. We'll touch on new technologies for measuring police-community relations, resident perceptions of and trust in the police, and for identifying emerging issues and needs in the community. We're going to work through some really exciting projects and approaches in Durham, Seattle, and Austin. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mike to get us started.
Thanks, Jake, for giving me the opportunity to speak about this project. Pete, the next slide, please. The project here we're talking about is Criminal Justice Testing and Evaluation Consortium. There's a project with NIJ, and it's focused on 4 tasks: technology foraging, testing evaluation, voluntary compliance testing program, and standards development. And what I'm going to touch on today is really related to the first 2 tasks related to how technology-enabled solutions can improve the way we measure police perceptions of law enforcement. So those 2, you might have heard about the third one, where we test and evaluate body armor, and to see if body armor meets the standards NIJ has set. The standards development task is around the validation and support for maintaining specific criminal justice equipment standards. So the first 2, technology foraging and testing evaluation, are 2 tasks where we really try to evaluate the state of the shelf and the state of the science related to technology that supports cops, courts, and corrections, as we say. The next slide, please. So how do we go about tech foraging? Well, we have a number of ways where we collect this information. First, we conduct a literature review of what we know about the state of whatever technology we're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at technology to measure police perceptions of the police through the community. We'll talk to experts in the field who have been conducting these types of studies. We'll go to the actual practitioners, so law enforcement executives, or community-based organizations, or other stakeholders within the community that use this information to get an understanding of the challenges and the needs they face in terms of trying to utilize this information. And then we'll go and get information from vendors through a request for information and through interviews with vendors to really try to get a better understanding of why they're in the space, the challenges they see that practitioners are facing, and how their products could help solve those needs, those challenges. Next slide, please. So today, we're really looking at what technologies are available that can measure what the community thinks about law enforcement agencies. So this slide here is about the why. So why do that? Why get input from the community about your performance? And we know there's a lot of things here that are really important in terms of just basic engagement with the community. You also get input from the community about emerging issues and concerns about the community. Not all problems are reported to the police through 911 or other means. So engaging the community to get a sense about how they feel their community safety is, or other issues in the community that are really important to them that law enforcement could help address is an important why question. And other things deal with performance, in practices. Can law enforcement utilize this information to increase their performance in terms of how they conduct their activities? And then there's a general line of research related to engaging the community and increasing transparency builds community confidence and trust. And in turn, that community confidence and trust increases cooperation. And so when you have communities highly engaged and they're cooperative, law enforcement can do a better job with solving crimes, preventing crimes. Next slide, please. So we have the why, you should do it. And then this slide is really the what. So what information can you get from the community that will be reliable, valid, and valuable to law enforcement? And there are a number of measures and constructs that are often typically measured. One about effectiveness. How effective do you think the police are doing to prevent crime, to respond to crime? Other line of research is related to the fear in crime. So how safe do you feel in your community? What kind of risk do you feel when you're walking to the store or you're out in your community? Third is satisfaction and procedural justice, number 5 too. Those relate to really when you have contact with law enforcement, how satisfied were you with that response? Were you treated fairly? Were you treated in terms of the resolution of your case? How well was your case resolved? And what did you think about that engagement? And then fourth, what I talked about is emerging issues. It's really about identifying those quality of life issues, or there's other types of activities in the community that might not be getting to law enforcement, but might be really important to learn from direct input from the community. Next slide. I was alone here, trying to be mindful of time. So this slide and what we're talking about for the next few slides is really about now the how. So how do you go about collecting this information? And what we refer to as traditional measures or traditional approaches have been really relying on phone interviews, calling up people in a random survey to get their input, or doing some sort of mail out or driving people to a website. And these traditional approaches suffer from many limitations, which I'll touch on, but there's two general approaches to collect information. And one is post-contact follow-up surveys, and the other is a general community survey. So post-contact follow-up survey, exactly what it sounds like, is you had some sort of contact with the police, whether it's police-initiated or citizen-initiated through like 911, or you had a traffic stop. And then a day or two later, a week later, that citizen, that resident, will get a survey, whether it's a phone call, a knock on the door, or a mail survey, to ask them about, their encounter with law enforcement. So what you're getting there is you're getting input directly from someone who's had contact with the police. The other approach is a general community survey. And here, you direct people to a website, or you send out, usually traditionally you send out some sort of form, a questionnaire that they fill out, or you do a random survey. And here you're asking people, all residents within a community, about their contact or measures around the police. But the key here is that it's everyone in the community or a representative sample that may or may not have had any contact with law enforcement. But again, you're getting input around their perceptions with law enforcement. Another thing to be concerned with is that in a general community survey, you're talking about the residential population within some sort of jurisdiction. But you think of urban area or any other place, well, take for example, Washington, D.C. The daily population there is not just the residential population, but pre-COVID, a lot of people come into work, there's tourists. So a general community survey won't reflect those people, that ambient population that comes to that jurisdiction in a given day. And the contact survey, of course, will not include those folks that have had no contact with law enforcement. And in fact, it may include a bunch of people that don't reside in that neighborhood. They might be driving through, they might be there for a day, they might be there for work. So important distinctions. and important value of each of these approaches. Okay, next slide. So part of our project is to identify how technology can improve some of the limitations we typically face with, say, a mail-out survey or a phone survey, and some of the new challenges that arise with these technologies. And so some things like governance and data issues, who owns the data, who's actually using the data, who has input on the questions being asked. Agency specificity, when you ask someone about, okay, how do you think the police are doing? Well, where I live, just outside of DC, there's 4 or 5 agencies that I could come in contact with on any given day. The sheriff, the local PD, the municipal PD that's just down the street, the park police. So making sure that the person filling out the form knows which agency you're talking about is really important. Coverage and non-responsiveness, this deals with who answers your survey. So are you really getting at those people in the community most impacted by law enforcement activity and crime? That's a real important concern. Costs, right? These surveys typically are not cheap. They're very, very expensive and could involve a lot of resources. 5 is the lead organization intent and purpose. So who's conducting the survey? If you have an independent organization conducting a survey for an agency or for a city versus, say, law enforcement knocking on someone's door and saying, how do you feel about the police? You might get very different responses based on someone's perceived intent of the information being collected. Timeliness is another concern. Many times these traditional collections take multiple months to get input from the community. So it'll take 5, 6, 7 months or even a year to produce, to collect information, to analyze it, and to produce a report. So timeliness is a concern. Instrument design and measurement error. These are things related to, do people really understand the question you're asking? Is the questionnaire burdensome? Is it 20 pages long, or is it just 10 quick questions? So really trying to understand how you're asking the question and what type of responses will produce valid and reliable estimates. And then geographic and subpopulation precision. Often we want not just to know how a city residents feel about the law enforcement, but we want more precision around geography, neighborhood level, community level, and even subpopulations. So racial breakouts, gender breakouts, and other types of populations that are really important to know about, their perceptions of law enforcement. And then the challenges with just analysis and dissemination. Many agencies just don't have the capacity to collect the data themselves, to analyze it, to disseminate it. So they're relying on third-party organizations to assist with that. Next slide. So we are doing the scan, and these are just examples of the technology-enabled solutions and organizations that are out there in the space. We're in the middle of our study now. Post-contact follow-up surveys, you have Axon My90, SpiderTech. On the right side, general community surveys, our Zen City is one example. Again, these are 2 different approaches and with 2 different ways to collect information that have different types of value. Next slide. Click here. We can skip this one, just go to the next one in terms of just to save time. So some of the things we're finding in terms of these technologies, not specific to any one vendor, they are improving some of these concerns. Coverage and non-responsiveness. We're finding that many of these technologies are able to give a better representation of the population that's in the area. So by using smartphone technology, where over 80% of people have a smartphone these days, versus mailing out a survey or trying to call somebody. So you can get a better representative because you put it on their smartphone. They can answer the survey whenever they have time versus calling them on the phone and catching them at a bad time. So really, these technologies, there's signs that they're improving the representativeness of the population responding. The lead organization intent and purpose, right? These are third parties that are conducting the survey for law enforcement agencies. Timeliness, many of these technologies can produce data on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So you're getting real-time perceptions of performance and emerging problems versus taking months and months to gather data. And then the flexibility of these technologies. You can add questions, delete questions pretty quickly with these tools. And again, the geographic subpopulation precisions, many of them are offering community level precision in terms of understanding how communities within a jurisdiction vary in terms of their perception. And then the analysis and dissemination, a big benefit from many of these technologies is that they're putting out dashboards and they're getting the information back out to the community and increasing transparency with these responses. So you're just not collecting the data and the agencies holding on to it, they're actually sharing it back and increasing that engagement with the community. Okay, next slide. I think we're finishing up. But there are still some issues that are still maybe unresolved or we haven't really settled on. One is equity and accessibility, making sure that we're getting this information out to the right people. Coverage and non-responsiveness. Well, coverage and non-response, are reduced. These limitations are reduced in terms of getting a representative population. There's still some concerns that not everyone is actually engaging with these tools. There is the digital divide, right? We know certain populations, older people, don't have smartphones and may not be able to access these tools. And then privacy and governance. Again, when you're dealing with a third-party collection, who actually owns the data and what type of privacy ensures that the respondent's information won't be shared out. So we're still working through these issues. We plan to have a brief out later this year to provide an assessment of the landscape of these tools for folks interested in collecting information from the community. And that's, I think, my last slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for walking us through CJ Tech's approach and the different spaces that you're all thinking about and evaluating across these spaces. We'll head right into Dwayne Campbell's presentation now. Dwayne, you're up.
Thank you, Jake. My name is Dwayne Campbell, and I'm a fellow in the Department of Community Safety in Durham. I want to first introduce you to my department. My department started in July last year, July 2021. I consider my department a pandemic department for many reasons. In addition to it being born during the time of the pandemic, there are many issues that were occurring across America that affected the justice individuals and the justice system. Based on issues around George Floyd and others, there are many community advocates in Durham who started asking for the city council to create an alternative response to policing. With that, the community safety department was given an idea, and only last year, as I said, we started. Next slide, please. The key questions that I'll be addressing today are on the screen here. What is Durham's Community Safety Department about? How to effectively establish buy-in and feedback up front from the entire community. How to ensure community buy-in. Do these approaches that we have in the Community Safety Department make impact based on the intended goals that we have for the department? What are some of the promising examples that should be looked at and replicated across the country? And transparency, how do we disseminate this information? If you think I haven't answered any of those questions at the end of the presentation, please ask me, and I'll be more than happy to respond to you. Next slide, please. So to begin with, I'm going to ask that we refer to the Menti link that is on the screen and use the code. And the question that I'm asking each of you to answer is, what are 3 types of examples of 911 calls that do not require an armed responder? If you check the chat box, you may be able to see the link and the code. And I'll just give you about 30 seconds to put whatever response you have there, please. Thanks to those of you who have entered your ideas about calls that may not require armed responders. So far, the most predominant response among us here are mental health calls. We also have many respondents talking about overdose, false alarms, noise complaints, we have substance abuse, we have runaway juvenile, we have minor vehicle collision, we have code theft, animal control, traffic hazard, civil disputes, 911, hang up, suspicious people, and I could go on and on here, homelessness. And in fact, these are some of the calls that my department are considering to make the unarmed responders. And to be clear, we want to make sure that we also underscore that our department has no adversarial relationship with the police. In fact, we think the police force is very useful, and we've been building our pilots in collaboration with the police force and other community agencies. But what we're saying is, based on the calls that you have named in this conversation, that there are other experts who may be needed to address these calls so the police could better deal with other more pressing issues around violence in our community. Next slide, please. So in 2020, next slide, please. So in 2020, the city of Durham, in partnership with RTI, did an investigation of the 911 calls here. So we had lots of data on 911 calls, so much so that we could track to see what time of day. And if you look here, we thought that that we have a 45 right in the middle here, that at about 4 p.m. On Tuesdays, because you represent Sunday, one represent Monday, Tuesday, that we see many incidents occurring about this time. And we did this chart to see what time should we ensure that we have these professionals addressing these calls that you have shared with us that may not be requiring armed responders. We also use the data, which was mostly quantitative, to identify, where are these calls coming from most, and you can see that in the map. We also looked at the data using census tracts. And I point this out to say we have used traditional methods for our research as well. We have only decided to move away from the traditional, wrong wording. We've decided to include other non-traditional ways of collecting data to ensure that we can fully understand what we're seeing from the quantitative section. The next slide, please. And based on that, our team developed really 4 different pilots that we hope to start in early summer this year. And the pilots are the crisis call diversion pilot. Then we have the community responder team, we have the co-response, and the care navigator. A quick explanation of these is the crisis call diversion. You have an embedded clinician in our 911 center who can address certain calls on the phone without an in-person presence. There are other calls that may come in that may require in-person presence, and that's where we will call on our community responder team, or CRT team, who will be a mobile crisis team essentially out there in the community, addressing the many different issues, again, that you raised earlier, so that we can ensure that our residents are having the professionals that they need at that time in their times of crisis. In addition to that, we will be launching a co-response program, which will include a clinician and a member of the police department who will do similar work, but where we think that there may be need for police presence, that's where the co-response team comes in. In fact, based on our many conversations with community members, we decided, unlike all the other cities that we looked at in our preparation for these pilots, that we will also have a care navigator team. And what the care navigators will do is they'll do primarily follow-up calls to ensure that residents are getting the support, the ongoing support that they need to ensure that they address the issues that had caused them to initially contact our department. The next slide, please. With these pilots, we hope to do what you see on the screen. We hope to increase connection to care, increase the comfort of individuals calling 911. We know presently there are many individuals, including myself, who many times hesitate because I don't want to call 911, because I don't want something bad to happen. We want to increase law enforcement capacity. We also, on the other hand, want to make sure that we reduce emergency room use and reduce law enforcement encounters, among other things. Next slide, please. So with that said, our team has been intentional in using a multi-pronged approach. I'll first point out that, and this is in no particular order, but we started out with the data that I referenced with the 2020 study with RTI, looking at our 911 calls here in Durham. And that was the basis of most of our, well, that was a platform for our work essentially. I also want to point out that we have been in partnership with what we have here in Durham, the city of Durham, the Community Safety and Wellness Task Force, which was really called into action by the three political groups. And these are Durham Public School, the Durham County, the city of Durham. And there's 15 members who were appointed with 2 co-chairs. And this group meets monthly, and they discuss issues around community safety and wellness. Because though they're separate and apart, very autonomous from the Department of Community Safety, we do work along with them because they represent the community in many respects. And this group has people across the political spectrum, across different ages, different interest groups, and they work passionately in their volunteer work to suggest ideas and build recommendations that will ultimately come to our department or to the Durham County or to the Durham Public Schools, where they can have their recommendations come to ultimately become a pilot essentially. In addition to that, we are involved in a highly collaborative group. Partners of this group are in this call right now, where we meet with different professionals across the area, because we don't think that we as a department have the answers alone, and we want this to be a very collaborative effort if we're going to build buy-in. In addition to that, we have been partnering with other cities too. We're in a Harvard cohort with other cities who are doing very similar work in alternative responses. And what is most important here for me to underscore is that we have very often listening sessions where we're intentionally and authentically listening to residents across Durham to hear their concerns, their challenges, and their opportunities, as well as their suggestions on how to improve Durham. Next slide, please. Of course, because of the pandemic, we have been using a lot of Zoom and Microsoft Team. We just, for example, use Menti in this call. We've been using Menti with many of our residents, and Jamboard is another web software. We use SurveyMonkey to collect additional data after our town halls. And we've had 2 days of town halls already where residents have come to us and shared their ideas about how to address the concerns that they have. What exactly are the concerns that they have, as well as where we share the development of the pilots and ask the residents, these same residents, to critique what we have and make suggestions on how to improve these pilots so that they can be they can better serve them in their respective communities. We've attended churches to speak with members. We do lots of community chats, so residents have our number. They can reach out to us to have a listening session in their community, and we'll do that and have done that. I also want to point out that we have forthcoming plans to start going into convenience stores, bus stops and barbershops. Part of why we haven't done that already is obviously the pandemic. Next slide, please. But I want to quickly, because I have a short time left, focus the rest of my conversation on establishing buy-in. Our department is very people-centered. We recognize fully that as researchers and evaluators, we come into spaces with some privileges, and we don't understand what's happening on the ground. We recognize that fully, and for this reason, we have ensured that we've included in our plans to have community fellows as well as credible messengers who will work as liaison between the department and the community. We recognize also that while there may be recurring themes from our data that these recurring themes do not necessarily mean that these communities are monolithic. And so we try to understand even the challenges of outliers in the community. We try to also validate the residents' experiences, even if this is something that we have not experienced ourselves, and try to empower these residents to share their ideas. And this is how we build trust. And we on Tuesday, for example, we went to a senior home and we sat there just listening to residents' concerns and hear their feedback, took their numbers. And we do usually follow up with residents. And when we do stuff like that, residents recognize that we care authentically about their concerns, and we really want to address the situations that they're bringing to us. We have a very people-centered approach. And we recognize that the communities that are oftentimes affected most by the police or justice system are communities that have experienced lots of trauma. So we also enter these spaces with using trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please. To ensure that we maintain accountability to the residents, as well as continue to be transparent to the residents, we have committed ourselves to ensure that we publish monthly metrics on our website and continue to have dialogues with the people in the community, because many people may not have access to these websites. And as opposed to going in these communities and sapping information from these individuals, we intend instead to continue having conversations with them even after the launch of these pilots, so that they can share with us how we have been doing, what needs improvement, what suggestions for tweaking that they have, and what other pilots do they suggest that we introduce to the work that we do. This is the last comment, I also want to point out, it is more than just where we go to collect the data, but how we do this, how we emphasize and solidify the residents' dignity. Oftentimes, we have researchers going into communities without, that authentic care for the individuals, and looking at these individuals as more than just research subjects or research participants, but as people with lived experiences, with real challenges, and wanting real solutions to these challenges. And so we encourage people to do like what we're doing, to build authentic relationships with these community members. I think I'm out of time, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I will follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thanks for sharing your experience and your work in Durham. I'm going to hand it over to Lauren Atherley. Before I do, just a quick reminder for folks, if you have any questions as we're going through these presentations, anything that you want followed up on, we'll sort of collect them throughout this process, and then in the Q&A session at the end, we'll be able to work through those. So you can go ahead and use the chat function right at the bottom of your screen if anything comes to mind. With that, I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Lauren. I'm the Director of Performance Analytics and Research at the Seattle Police Department. We're going to talk a little bit about how the program has evolved from compliance with the consent decree to continuing that progress and that forward momentum with intelligent decision supported accountability. Oh, sorry, that was a little slow there. So our program is called Performance Analytics and Research, and it's a little different from most police departments in that we have a crime analysis component at Seattle PD, as well as a research and evaluation component. The Performance Analytics and Research group actually grew out of our efforts to comply with a federal consent decree. And just about 4 years ago, as the department was kind of wrapping up and cruising into the sustainment period of compliance, the question was, okay, great. So we have this robust research and evaluation component. We have some data warehousing, data governance components, and advanced analytics processing. What are we going to do with that after the consent decree? And this actually was sort of conveniently timed with questions about how the department is going to continue to sustain progress in a more fair and equitable police service beyond the federal consent decree period, and really own and capture those improvements, those process improvements, those decision and policymaking improvements, and continue forward progress towards a more equitable service. So the Performance Analytics and Research Group started to think about this, and eventually kind of arrived at this advanced analytics capacity in very much the same way that the department had arrived at business intelligence. And I think anybody who's worked with business intelligence products will come to realize that it very quickly begins to build its own weather. The more analytics you pump out, the more dashboards that you produce, the more intelligent decision insights and advanced reports that you produce, the more engagement that you end up getting from the management group, the employee group, and the community. And so carrying that forward seemed sort of the logical process, but also a necessity, beginning to build on what was largely descriptive data and render sort of statistically processed and rigorous results for people to engage in a meaningful business capacity without having to actually worry about what the underlying analytics were, has really become kind of our ethos. So just real quick, the Performance Analytics and Research Group is actually comprised of 3 different components: a research component, a data warehousing component, and a data governance component. And we have 4 stakeholders. We have Strategic Initiatives, which is an internal group at Seattle PD that's a command staff level group. We have the Chief Operating Officer. We have the Office of Inspector General, which is really sort of transitioning and taking over that role from the Federal Monitor as we transition out of the consent decree. And then we have Enterprise Risk Management, which is where my operation currently lives. So all 4 of these groups comprise the Executive Steering Committee group. And then the 3 sub-programs underneath Performance Analytics and Research develop new things and then roll them into the operation. The research group works with folks like RTI, works with universities. We have about 55 active members in our research group, currently a portfolio of somewhere around 20 in progress research projects with just about 35 different research institutions around the globe. And they provide us sort of interesting methods, interesting insights into policy and procedure that help us kind of roll the latest of the science back into the operation and really help to engage the employee group and the management group. Our kind of motto here is, if you dream it, we'll build it. COTS, custom, open source, and share it with the world. We're really dedicated to not just productizing things, but actually productionizing them, operationalizing them, taking a new propensity score matching process, rolling it into the operation, generating some interesting insights, and then actually sharing that. So this year, we're transitioning to the cloud. We're using a lot of Python and R, producing some Jupyter notebooks, and we'll be releasing those in a public Git this year. So that's kind of in progress and a little bit what's coming up in the future. So I'm going to talk very briefly about our philosophy. This is really about generating curiosity, data curiosity, and contextualizing that within the business understanding. So you've got these people who are police managers, police commanders who understand the business of policing. But I think as data and analytics are becoming more common in law enforcement, what we're finding is that their sort of specific analytical understanding of that environment is probably just a little bit different from quantitatively what we see. So it's about generating engagement. The idea is good actors will respond predictably to appropriate stimuli. Small corrections made earlier superior to large, overcorrections at the last minute, and active risk management fosters a culture of active engagement on the part of managers across the business. The idea is top down, bottom up, everybody pulling in the same direction, and you can actually use analytics for that purpose. So what we've done is take a lot of intelligent decision support type processes that are very common, already actually out there in the world. I don't know if any of you are familiar with intelligent decision support, but it's actually pretty well infused in a lot of consumer products. This is an example of how forward-looking infrared and sort of machine vision is used for head-up displays in aircraft and in collision avoidance for automated vehicles and for pilots making night approaches to really nasty airports. Small corrections made early. The last sort of little analogy I like to make here before we kind of jump in is we're trying to create enough self-serve analytics, enough awareness and engagement of the operation that the pilot of a ship in the fog has the ability to make course corrections on their own within the sort of context and understanding of what the good is, right? In policing, the good is pretty difficult to kind of nail down. It's not a deliberate, as deliberate as we like to think of it. But, you know, in the context of navigating a ship, obviously impacting the ground, running aground is bad. So we like to provide enough information that is actually fully contained within that operation. Something like a navigation portal. Intelligent decision support isn't just about providing a map and a chart and updating those charts on a regular basis to carry forward this navigation analogy, but it's really about having kind of a common operating picture for the navigation system or for the operation to allow the captain to steer that ship into a safe port. So we approach this strategically with this program that we're calling Equity, Accountability, and Quality. And this is our CompStat sort of next generation, if you will. CompStat obviously being that sort of well-established process of actively and regularly engaging in performance metrics and holding pieces of the operation accountable for performance and efficacy in that environment. But I think we've come to realize that crime is not actually the best way to manage the efficacy of a police service. There are other collateral impacts that are associated with the delivery of police service. And I like to say crime is a terrible way to measure police performance. There are plenty of safe places that nobody wants to live. So equity, accountability, and quality, which is currently in process here, and I apologize, the equity component here does have the performance metrics obscured. This process is in the large scale integration phase. We're actually working with RTI currently as our third-party quality assurance contractors. And because this is an uncomfortable area for most police services to approach, we're being a little bit respectful in this case and obscuring those performance metrics until they're really locked down. But the intention is to eventually produce this equity dashboard publicly so that the public can see. This is our first version of the equity dashboard using propensity score matching, actually, and applying the propensity scores as weights to develop a metric, which is actually the absolute difference between the frisk rate for white and non-white folks contacted in Terry stops. And you can see immediately that the numbers themselves actually aren't that important. The numbers by themselves don't mean very much. What you're really looking at here is insights from the geographic distribution of disparity across the operation, as well as across the time series. Decomposing this pretty dense piece of analytics actually gives you a little bit of insight in how disparity moves across the operation. You can play with this time series a little bit and see that there's a simple seasonal trend there. There's also a 3-period polynomial that you're seeing with like an 18 to 24-month period wave. There are a couple of shocks and spikes. This is a rich area for engagement. Our program, Equity, Accountability, and Quality, actually brings the command staff group once a month and asks them to engage and talk about and discuss why we're seeing anomalies in this, we're seeing spikes, we're seeing trends and changes. We're also including measures of accountability through a kernel density estimate of the residuals of police automated vehicle locator data. So we're taking the demand for police service and controlling for that demand, leaving behind points that are predicted by the model that aren't present, and points that are predicted that aren't predicted by the model but are present as over and under policing. And we visualize those as kernel density estimates and apply a conventional hotspots analysis to be able to provide a visual that you can also engage. You can talk about why there's concentration of police presence in a particular area and what that means, whether it's an operational security concern or whether it's a specific request for the community to engage in some problem-solving activities there. We also have a quality type analytics dashboard that's coming online. This one is the third in this three-component analytics product that's coming in this large-scale integration period. We're taking a natural language processing approach to body-worn video, processing and scoring interactions in the operation for quality, respect, sentiment, and beginning to take a look at what is typical of a police interaction, where we're seeing sentiment exaggerated, high and low polarity between the interaction of the community member and one of our officers. This whole package together is just like CompStat, provided to command staff in real time in dashboards available for them to subscribe to and monitor on a regular basis. And it's really something that is an ongoing process. This is the first draft of the equity, accountability, and quality analytics. We'll be adding enhancements to this, change point regressions, things that are beginning to alert the user to anomalies or emergent patterns in the data, things like space-time cubes that show you heating and cooling spots, and really starting to dig into some of the qualities of our interactions with people in the public to be able to determine a little bit more about what contributes to de-escalation. Is the officer's sentiment leading the sentiment of the subject that they're working with? Intelligent decision support accountability in this case is just the strategic component. And I'll just run through this real quick because I'm over time. But we also have a tactical component. I mentioned top down, bottom up. All of these analytics are on a roadmap to be diffused within the operation. I like to call this the orbital mechanics model change, because we want to work with the natural processes that exist in the operation. We want to work with the way that things move and ideas process and people function in the environment. And that means producing analytics that provide sort of right time guidance to managers who understand their business, and then connecting those with that strategic focus. The equity, accountability, and quality measures diffused through the operation in dashboards that help managers and commanders keep an eye on the things that are important to our community. This is a forthcoming structure that we're building out, enterprise risk management operations, that really takes a safety management approach to diffusing these products throughout the operation. Very much like industrial safety or in commercial aviation, trying to provide champions and right-sizing the analytics for the operation to help managers and commanders respond to the things that are important to them. And those are some projects that are on the horizon. But I'm a little over time. Culture change through subtle environmental design is kind of our thing, and we accomplish that through intelligent decision support accountability.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for giving us some perspective on inside a police department. I think you are doing a lot of interesting things there that would be helpful for other folks to learn from as well. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mimi Stiles to talk about Measure.
Thank you. Hopefully you can all see me well. Yep, there we go. Awesome. Hello and good afternoon or good morning, wherever it is that you are attending today. My name is Mimi Stiles, and I get to be the founder and the president of Measure. It's a research and public education organization. I'll go to the next slide. Awesome. So I'll start with this big question. What is community power building? And so according to the University of California's Equity Research Institute, community power building is about building the ability of communities that are most impacted by systems, by structural oppression, to set the agenda toward changing systems to create and sustain both neighborhood public safety and healthy communities. So in my work, in my understanding, in my experience, a community's greatest superpower has really been their capacity to drive social change. And so throughout history and what you see in front of you, worldwide movements that promote good and awareness have been driven by these same communities. And so whether it's women's suffrage or the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, Black Lives Matter, resistance against apartheid, the movement for Indigenous rights, it's really the community's unwillingness to really accept that status quo and their equal commitment to realizing a new normal, especially in research and data, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, to see that these advancements move to real positive reform. And go to the next slide. All right, here's another big statement, bold statement. So despite decades of critical research on social justice movements, on police accountability, the pitfalls of techno-solutionism, the evidence provided by even folks with lived experience themselves of powerful Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, the promise of real shared power in the pursuit of public safety and social justice really does remain elusive. So my question that I always ask when we are leaning into thinking about community engagement and using data and research as a means to do so is how should researchers, public safety professionals, community members, how should we evaluate the effectiveness of community policing or community relations, community engagement in a way that actually results in that first definition of community power? So I'd like you to kind of think about that as I continue to share. Next slide. Awesome. There's our website. We'd love for you to continue to, should be another W there, but love for you to continue to learn more about what we do. But we're a research and public education organization that is led by Black women. We are led by Black women, led by Black women. I say that 3 times for a reason. And we're dedicated to using data and technology to really pursue community-defined goals. Since our founding in 2015, we provided over 3,014 hours of free anti-racist evaluation support to our community to increase their access and use of data. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so our theory of change is truly a reflection of the culmination of work that we do at Measure. So we've partnered with over 30 community-led projects within the last 2 years with folks from the University of Texas, New York University, Texas Southern University, the City of Austin, several community foundations that give money, right, to supporting organizers and et cetera on the ground. And even more importantly, the many activist organizations and advocacy organizations across the state. And so we really, truly learned to listen. And so as we've also taught and shared with, police, academies and across America, and even in Australia, we've also learned to dig really deep into the way that we engage community with the message of, yes, engage, but do no harm. And if you do see that harm is being done through the research process, then pivot and change and slow down. And so this is why the result being communities, they should leave the engagement with authentic power, with the feeling of grace and the feeling of empathy. And that's really what fuels our theory of change. And we can go to the next slide. Awesome. So as a catalyst for systems change, Measure has held over, has held 5 what we call big data and community policing conferences. We're really kind of toying with that, with the name for our next conference. I'm thinking more so big data and public safety. And so what we've learned through these engagements is that a few things, right? So 1, police chiefs are critical to cultural change. When we first launched the work with Measure, former APD Chief Acevedo, he really began an open data rollout. So he really supported this idea of cultural change in Austin. Following up with Chief Manley, who also had a huge stake in encouraging community collaboration. So police chiefs, number 1, are critical to cultural change and making sure that we're able to engage well. Number 2 is that cultural change really requires internal and external legitimacy. So internally, officers must understand the rationale of the new approach. It can't just be here, this is what we're doing. There has to be a clear understanding and a buy-in within the department, as well as the community, of what is happening and why we're doing that. Externally, the department must share the data and invite feedback in an anti-racist way. And I'll kind of share with you how we do that. Next is that partnerships with community are now common at high and medium levels. That's something that we've learned from these discussions through Texas and also in California. But the issue there is that we have patrol officers or officers on the ground, on the lower ground levels, they also need to be engaged. We've also learned that data is often messy, and I think most folks know that, and difficult to integrate. So records management systems are not always designed for research and analysis, or we have older systems that contain valuable data that might be really hard or even in some cases impossible to integrate. And then lastly, what we've also learned through these engagements is that data can actually become obscure among department officials and activists, right? So what do I mean by that? Yes, data can reveal racial disparities, right, with use of force, et cetera. Data can also be used as a great means for collaborative problem solving, right? But the concern that we also have heard is that data collaboration efforts can also sometimes deepen racial tensions between police departments and the communities that they serve. Maybe it's almost like hiding behind the data. And in fact, one of the quotes that picture of us in San Diego, which is the second picture, the gentleman in there said he wants to make sure that data isn't just used as a highlighter, but actually used as a hammer. And that was the disconnect between his organization and the police department, is that it was not used as that. It was just like, oh yeah, we see the problem, but what are we doing about it? Next slide. Awesome. So to address the concerns of our community over several years of work, of us hosting conferences with activists, police, researchers, techies, we've learned that without an equitable framework built into research protocols, models, or tools, from the beginning, we actually risk the continual perpetuation of racism within our largest institutions. We've learned that if your research is not intentionally anti-racist, right, then it can simply advance the several layers of racism that we continue to battle today. We've been thinking pretty deeply about this work at Measure, and what you see in front of you are 4 of our anti-racist data support tools that we use and that we support communities with. In fact, we do this work for free for Black and Brown and Indigenous-led organizations, and then we partner with cities and schools and other folks to do it at cost, so that we're able to do it for free with our community. So you'll see the CARE model, which I'll talk about in a second, the equity focus group tool. So I heard so many great speakers today already talk about their listening sessions. Well, we have a methodology that was actually created by our community, with our community, for our community. In fact, over 400 community members came together to help us co-design and co-create many of our tools. We have the community survey development tool, right? And so this tool is really one, again, where community members are supporting the creation of the data. In fact, when I first got my kind of work started in Austin, Texas, I was on a panel, and I was supposed to be the angry activist woman on that panel. I knew I was supposed to be that person because what I saw was, it was just me. I was the only Black woman, right? And instead of being angry, what I started to do on that panel that was about community policing was to start asking questions about survey methodology. Who created the survey? Who was involved in it? What are the metrics that are assessing the survey, and how did community support in the development of it? And so that then prompted me to really kind of create these solutions along with our community members so that we were able to answer those questions. Next slide. All right, I'll go kind of quick here. This is the CARE model, and it looks a little bit obscured on this slide, but I will, hopefully you can kind of see it okay. But the CARE model is our bread and butter. It's the data-driven method that we use to build community power, that definition that I gave you earlier. It's a process of really working in active partnership with our community in order to, delve deep into those complex social issues, right? Each letter really does represent that a component of this 12-week process communities involved from the very beginning. We advocate with community. We generate solutions that strengthen resilience. We use data and evidence for data-informed decisions. And so, you know, these principles truly allow us to think to think differently about how we engage in research and how we engage in community action that produces community power in the end. And so, to be very clear too, I just want, I'd like to say this because I'm also a huge proponent of EBP, which is evidence-based policing. And obviously most of y'all are too, but you know, evidence-based policing does involve the applying of rigorous testing to police tactics, procedures, and actions, right? The CARE model is a mobilization process that can support the research that is involved in EBP. And we'll go to the next slide. And I'll just say this because I know that I am running out of time. You know, community organizations for so many years, so many decades, have used their collective power to really pressure institutions to change laws and policies and behaviors in pursuit of equity. But unfortunately, many of these, you know, have lacked this, the stable or the rigorous methodology to measure progress or to coordinate efforts across time and space. In many cases, they're often siloed, or you know, organizations like mine sometimes feel isolated. And so it's truly our duty, those that have access to building technology or that have access or the ability to build tools like the tools that I shared today, to use them to do justice. And so it's my hope that after hearing some of the work that we do at Measure, that you choose also to do justice and leverage the your research in pursuit of equitable, community-driven power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Thank you all for presenting and sharing your experiences with us. We're moving to the Q&A session. I know we've gotten a couple questions in the chat. And as folks, if you have additional questions, please go ahead and throw those in there. We'll come back to them. But I don't want to delay, so I'll get right into the first question. One question, it was posed during Dwayne's presentation, but I think it may apply to Mimi's work with Measure as well. After you're collecting information from the community, from these community groups, how can you go about sort of creating that feedback loop and circling them back in with what has been done or what is being done with the information that you've collected?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a great question too, and I can answer it. Maybe I'm sure Dwayne probably has a little something there too. But my thought is that from the very beginning, having clear, what we call at Measure, lines in the sand, so that community has the expectation of receiving the data in the first place. So many times we have no idea that data is even, you know, being gathered and ready to be disseminated to us. And so I just want to say this super quick because I think that some of these lines in the sand might be helpful. Number one, make sure that the benefit to community is clearly defined. That's number one. Provide direct benefit to your community members that are helping you co-design your surveys, if you do that, or participating in your focus groups, if you do that. Making sure that communities are also given credit. There has been countless times where we have seen, you know, police departments putting out information that they did actually do the work of engagement, but didn't give the credit to the community member or the community organization. And so making sure that credit is given and credit is due. Next is that, you know, data ownership. Data should be owned by the people for the collective use of advocacy, change, and social progress. So are you thinking about that? Are you thinking about how is this data actually going to be used for us doing better as an organization, or for our city doing better as a more anti-racist or equitable city? And then lastly, it's really about justice. Like, I don't know how pacified so many organizational leaders, activists like myself have felt over the past few years, especially with the rise of data becoming sexy, right? Oh, we have data. This is going to explain away why this is happening to you, or and so that's not okay. So using the data in a way that truly partners with your community to formulate solutions together that again result in community power, meaning community members are ready to protect them, their own neighborhoods, or be or support and partner with the police department in order to make sure that they have the best form of public safety is actually the result.
Thank you. Dwayne, did you want to respond to that question as well?
Sure. So we have been collecting the contact information and name for all our participants. In addition to that, we work with the Community Safety Department with the Community Safety and Wellness Task Force. And we go to these meetings, especially for a couple of the roundtables weekly. And so we're constant contact with them and using an iterative approach to see what can be tweaked, what can be introduced. Plus, I mentioned earlier using our website to give updates to the public. And we also have introduced the community fellows as well as credible messengers as liaison between the department and the community, so that messaging can continue both ways between the community and the department.
Thank you, Dwayne. Next, I'll move on to another question. This one's for Lauren. Question is the program that you presented on, is it coming from the mayor's office or the police department? And are you really saying that crime reduction is not a function of the police department, but equity is?
Thanks. That's a great question. So first of all, this is actually an internally driven process. And I think this is kind of how I learned to stop worrying and love the consent decree. Our consent decree is designed to be data driven and evidence based. And so to that extent, it's really about leaning in and engaging the analytics. So it is an internally driven initiative. And I think that's important from a perspective of ownership. It's not something being imposed, but it's instead an internally generated strategy that we're carrying forward. The next piece is a little more complicated. And what I'll say is that I make no value judgment about what a police department should or shouldn't do in this case. I just mean methodologically speaking, from a performance management perspective, having a single measure, the crime rate in particular, to optimize or to push is just actually a very terrible way of managing an organization. And I like to think of this like an airplane. So I got my pilot's license when I was 17, and one of the first things you learn to do is not to chase your altitude. If you're fixated on one single measurement the entire time, you sort of lose track of all of the other components of straight and level flight. I think when you're talking about community safety, you're not just talking about crime control, or in this case, I think the academic community is trending towards the term harm reduction or other measures associated with a crime harm index. You're actually also talking about the collateral harms associated, not just the direct harms associated, and things like trust and legitimacy. And we can see that reflected in sort of this intense period of attention that we have sustained on doing something different with policing. So I'm not saying that crime reduction isn't the function of the police department. I'm just saying it makes a really terrible way of managing it. You have to sort of consider the total cost of ownership of public safety and try to balance all of those different performance indicators as you're sort of doing your best to optimize the outcomes.
Thanks, Lauren. Mike, one question that came in for you. What are some things that agencies should be considering before implementing or adopting these different strategies? What are some high points that you think police commanders and chiefs should really be thinking about?
Yeah. So talking to practitioners, talking to various stakeholders, it's really about why you want to collect this information and how are you going to use it. And I think really important is the development of the questions in terms of the actions afterwards. And I think Mimi is really touching on important points. I'm talking, I was agnostic to actually, the whole development stage. But what questions are being asked are really important in terms of community involvement, right? I mean, you can just ask a whole bunch of questions, but if they have no value or legitimacy with the community because of the way they were developed, you're not going to get the value. And the traditional approach is you send out a survey, you keep it internal, right? You're not transparent with it. And so I think when someone's looking to develop an approach to get community input, understanding the value of that information, what you measure, why you think what you're measuring is important, and that what you do with it and how you engage with community with it as an action item for improvement, I think are really, really important questions to be asked, because these are not cheap endeavors. And, if you're just checking the box, it's not going to be useful for anybody.
Thanks, Mike. And I guess one overarching question that helps to tie some of these pieces together. So what are some recommended approaches for sort of distilling all of this information and providing it back to the broader community in a way that is both understood and interpreted, I guess, effectively or usefully? Like you said, Mike, if the questions themselves aren't having legitimacy, then they're of little use to the folks that you're ostensibly helping. So what are some different strategies or approaches that can be used to share back this information that the police department can be used to help understand performance? And that's for any of the panelists that want to chime in on that one.
I can kind of chime in for a moment here on this question. And so again, the beauty is in the approach, the beauty is in the design. And and that's why I love the CARE model so much, because when you use that approach, it's like you don't even have to think about that question. Like when it comes to how do we share it out, right? Because your CARE team, right, that is involved in the CARE model is your community. It's the data that's collected, they're anticipating that data because they helped to design the protocol by which to go collect it. It's information that they need and that they want, and that will help them to, again, gain that community power that they need to self-advocate. And so I think that question really is about how are we designing it in a way that we don't even have to think about, the best way to share it out, to hopefully community members look at it and appreciate it. I've seen some really great ways that data has been used when doing it correctly, right? It might result in an incredible data walk at the library. It might result in a really cool, data party that I've seen before at the local colleges. It might result in, the newspapers that may be, kind of go under the radar. Like, for example, in Austin, we have the Villager newspaper, and everyone knows about the Villager newspaper. It's been around for a long time, but it's a predominantly Black newspaper. And they have actually published just really awesome looking data visualizations about police presence and accountability here in Austin, because community members were involved in the first place of creating it. And so I think that there's several different ways, but really it's about the process, the design, and by which you even begin to think about collecting data that communities can use.
In addition to what Mimi shared just now, our team was intentional in hiring a community-centered designer who used a human-centered design to ensure that whatever we're understanding from an evaluation and research perspective, that it can be distilled easily for the community to understand, and that it comes in a format, whether in language, pictures, whatever it is, for the average resident in Durham to be able to participate in this this initiative. And again, we've been using an iterative model and involved, and Mimi, again, you had mentioned this in your presentation where you have residents participating in the process. And so the residents themselves are informing these pilots in languages and ways that they understand that are immediately accessible to them. We plan to also, because we're a new department, we have not done this yet, but with the pilots starting summer, our plan is to use a lot of social marketing, which is another approach that is used to, especially in public health, to ensure that the information gets out there to the public in a way for the public to be able to understand and interact with that new information that might have otherwise been far too esoteric for them to understand.
I'd just like to add a little something from an internal police perspective. As you're thinking about developing analytics and performance analytics for your operation, I think especially as law enforcement administrators or managers or commanders, we tend to think security first. But there is a lot of value in demonstrating vulnerability and transparency in producing your analytics. Years ago, when we started producing reports for our consent decree, we also would release as much of the public data as we possibly could in a regular ongoing platform. So we have a public data portal that releases that information, a dashboard that allows sort of the lay user to be able to develop the same types of data curiosity that we encourage internally, and really be able to check some of the numbers that we produce in those annual reports. I think as we continue forward with our strategy to infuse data and analytics and performance metrics and evidence-based practices, we'll continue to make those products available externally, because I think there is a lot of value demonstrating vulnerability in showing that you're comfortable being transparent because you don't have anything to hide. And I think a lot of times the obscurity provided by having the security operations lens on top of things doesn't do a lot of good for us in terms of promoting trust and legitimacy in the community. So, it's great to think about all of these other sources of data that we're collecting for public sentiment and attitudes towards policing. But those same approaches, I think, apply internally to the data that we use for operations. And you can make them safe and approachable for the public so that they can follow you along and see how you're using data and what value it provides.
Can I also piggyback off of Lauren? Because Lauren, you said something so important about internal use of data. There is, so one thing that I have been so encouraged to see also here in Austin is that they're thinking about the young cadets, right? And so I co-facilitate a course with our young cadets here in Austin about how they are also data collectors and how they are so the community. Like a lot of times we kind of silo, our community, and then we have us, and that's not okay, right? And so making sure that the young cadets that are coming in they also form an appreciation of being also a data collector. And so I think I just really think that that's important to this conversation.
Thank you all. We're just about at time. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to present, Mike, Dwayne, Lauren, and Mimi. And thank you all for joining us and staying with us through these presentations. So with that, I'll hand it over to Peyton. I think we'll take us into our break.